I'm Joan Merrick, 67, and 3 months ago, I buried my husband David after a sudden heart attack in Oklahoma City. At 69, he seemed invincible, still working his garden, fixing things around our house of 40 years, talking about our golden anniversary next year. His death shattered my world, but I found comfort in his best friend Marcus, who held me as I sobbed at the funeral. Last Tuesday, Marcus called me, his voice trembling. "Joan, I need to tell you something about David's death. I knew it was coming, and I should have warned you." The words hit me like ice water. But what Marcus revealed next would uncover a web of secrets that made me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and the man I'd trusted with my grief. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt blindsided by loss, only to discover deeper betrayals, like this video. The love letter still sits on my nightstand, exactly where David left it that final morning. His handwriting, careful and deliberate despite his arthritis, fills the small card with words I've memorized. "My dearest Joan, 40 years feels like yesterday when I wake up next to you. Thank you for making every day an adventure. Your devoted husband, David." I found it when I returned from the hospital. A cruel reminder of the ordinary morning that became our last. That Tuesday started like any other. David made coffee while I scrambled eggs, our comfortable routine unchanged by 4 decades of marriage. We talked about the weather, how the tomatoes were coming along, whether we should finally replace the kitchen faucet. He kissed my forehead before leaving for the hardware store, promising to pick up paint samples for the guest bedroom. "See you at lunch, sweetheart," he called from the doorway. Those were his last words to me. I spent the morning reorganizing our photo albums, smiling at pictures from our honeymoon in Colorado, our son's wedding, grandchildren's birthdays. David and I had built a good life together. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. The house was paid off, our retirement modest but secure. We had plans a trip to see the grandkids in California, maybe a cruise for our 50th anniversary. The call came at 11:47 a.m. I remember because I was watching The Price is Right, and the contestant had just won a new car. Margaret Henderson from the store was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Joan, you need to come quickly." David collapsed. "The ambulance is here." The drive to the hospital exists in fragments. Running red lights, praying aloud, calling our son Michael with shaking hands. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and fear. A young doctor with kind eyes delivered the news with practiced gentleness: massive heart attack. Nothing they could do. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I held David's hand in that sterile room, his wedding ring still warm against my palm. His face looked peaceful, younger somehow, without the worry lines that had deepened over the past year. I thought about our morning conversation, how normal everything had seemed. How could I not have known? How could a heart simply stop after beating faithfully for 16 years? The funeral arrangements passed in a blur. Michael flew in from Seattle, taking charge of details I couldn't focus on. The service was lovely. Our pastor spoke about David's generosity, his dedication to family and community. The hardware store employees shared stories about his patience with difficult customers, his willingness to help anyone with a home repair project. Marcus gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he described their 30-year friendship. He spoke about David's integrity, his love for me, his pride in our children and grandchildren. Standing at the podium, Marcus seemed to age before my eyes, grief etched into every line of his face. "David Merrick was the best man I've ever known," he concluded. "He leaves behind a legacy of love, loyalty, and service to others. We are all better for having known him." The words were beautiful, but something in Marcus's delivery felt strained, as if he were reciting lines from a script rather than speaking from the heart. Marcus Chen had been David's closest friend since they met at a home improvement seminar in 1993. Both men were in their 40s then, established in their careers but eager to learn new skills. David owned Merrick Hardware, a small but thriving business he'd inherited from his father. Marcus worked as a contractor, specializing in kitchen renovations. Their friendship grew from shared projects and mutual respect. I remember the first time David brought Marcus home for dinner. He was recently divorced, lonely, and grateful for our family's warmth. Over the years, Marcus became like a brother to David and an uncle to our children. He spent holidays with us, helped David expand the store, and was always available when we needed him. Marcus had a gift for fixing things, not just broken faucets or electrical problems, but people's troubles, too. When our daughter Sarah went through her difficult divorce, Marcus spent hours helping her move, painting her new apartment, installing security systems. When Michael struggled with his small business, Marcus connected him with potential clients and offered financial advice. Marcus has such a generous heart. I often told David, we're lucky to have him in our lives. David would nod, but sometimes I caught a shadow crossing his face. When I asked about it, he'd just say, Marcus carries his own burdens, Joan. We all do. In the weeks following David's funeral, Marcus became my lifeline. He handled the business details. David had always managed contacting insurance companies, organizing paperwork, dealing with the stores, vendors. He brought groceries, fixed the squeaky bedroom door, and sat with me during the long, empty evenings. You don't have to do all this, I told him one evening as he repaired a loose step on the front porch. David would do the same for me if our situations were reversed, he replied, not looking up from his work. Marcus's devotion seemed to deepen my grief rather than ease it. His presence was a constant reminder of David's absence. When Marcus laughed at something on television, I heard the echo of David's laughter. When Marcus fixed my coffee exactly how I liked it, I remembered David's hands performing the same ritual every morning for 40 years. But I was grateful for Marcus's help. The business side of death was overwhelming: forms to fill out, accounts to close, decisions to make about the store's future. Marcus guided me through each step with patience and expertise. David always said you were the smartest person he knew, Marcus told me one afternoon as we sorted through David's office files. But he also said you trusted him to handle the business stuff because you had more important things to focus on. More important things: your family, your volunteer work at the church, your art classes. David said you made their house a home, while he just made sure the bills got paid. I found Marcus's eulogy speech a week later, tucked into David's desk drawer. The handwritten notes were extensive, covered with crossouts and revisions. But what caught my attention were the personal details, things about David's fears, his health concerns, his worries about the future, details that seemed too intimate, too specific for a friend to know. One note particularly stood out. David's biggest fear wasn't death, it was leaving Joan unprepared. He worried constantly about her financial security, about whether she'd be able to manage without him. He lost sleep over it, especially these past few months. David had seemed fine to me, a little tired, maybe, but nothing that suggested serious health problems. How had Marcus known about David's sleep troubles when I, his wife of 40 years, hadn't noticed? The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was heating leftover soup for dinner. Marcus's voice sounded different, strained, almost desperate. Joan, I need to see you. Tonight there's something I have to tell you about, David. My heart raced. What kind of something? Not over the phone. I'm coming over. He arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale and drawn. Marcus had always been meticulous about his appearance, but tonight his shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. He sat heavily in David's favorite chair, avoiding my eyes. I've been wrestling with this for months, he began. Even before David died, I was torn between respecting his wishes and protecting you. Now I can't live with the guilt anymore. Marcus, you're scaring me. What guilt? He pulled out a manila folder, thick with medical documents. David was seeing a cardiologist, Dr. Rodriguez, at Oklahoma Heart Center. He'd been going for almost a year. The room seemed to tilt. That's impossible. David would have told me if he was having heart problems. He made me promise not to tell you. He said you'd worry yourself sick, that you'd never let him live normally if you knew how serious his condition was. I stared at the folder in his hands. How serious? His arteries were severely blocked. Dr. Rodriguez recommended immediate surgery, maybe even a transplant evaluation. David refused. He said he'd rather die than put you through the stress and expense of major medical procedures. The words hit me like physical blows. He was dying, and he didn't tell me. He was trying to protect you, Joan. You know how David was about money, about being a burden. He'd convinced himself that if he just took medication and changed his diet, he could manage the condition quietly. Marcus opened the folder, revealing printouts of test results, appointment schedules, prescription records. David's name was on every page, along with dates spanning almost the entire previous year. I drove him to appointments when he was too weak to drive himself. I sat in the waiting room during his tests. I listened to him argue with the doctor about treatment options. I begged him to tell you, Joan. I begged him dozens of times. My hands shook as I looked through the documents. Stress tests, echocardiograms, medication adjustments. The progression was clear. David's condition had been deteriorating steadily for months. The day he died, Marcus continued, he called me from the store. He said he was having chest pains, that his medication wasn't helping. I told him to call 911 to get to the hospital, but he said he needed to finish inventory first, that he'd promised Margaret he'd help her with the quarterly reports. He chose inventory over his life. He chose normalcy over fear. David was terrified that if he acknowledged how sick he was, everything would change. Your relationship, your retirement plans, your whole life together. He thought he could handle it alone. I felt a surge of anger, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. So you helped him lie to me for a year. You watched him deteriorate and said nothing. I tried to convince him. You tried. My husband was dying, and you tried. I stood up, pacing the living room. I had a right to know, Marcus. I had a right to be there, to help him, to say goodbye properly. Marcus buried his face in his hands. I know. I've been eating myself alive with guilt. I should have told you, months ago, should have ignored David's wishes. But he was my best friend, and he begged me to respect his decision to lie to his wife, his decision to die alone rather than trust the person who loved him most. He didn't think of it as lying. He thought of it as protecting you. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of David's deception. How many doctor's appointments had he attended while I thought he was at the store? How many nights had he lain awake worrying about his heart while I slept peacefully beside him? There's more, Marcus said quietly. The medical bills, the insurance claims, the financial implications of his condition. David was terrified about the cost of treatment. He'd been researching experimental procedures, clinical trials, anything that might give him more time without bankrupting your family. We have insurance, we have savings, not enough for what he needed. A heart transplant, if he'd qualified, could have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. David did the math, Joan. He knew that saving his life might cost you your financial security. The cruelest part was that David's logic made sense. He'd always been the practical one, the planner, the protector. In his mind, he was making a sacrifice to preserve my future comfort. But he'd robbed me of the chance to make that choice with him. After Marcus left that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David's morning routine, how he'd always been first in the bathroom, always organized his daily vitamins while I was still in bed. I'd assumed it was just another sign of his methodical nature. At 3 a.m, I finally gave up on sleep and went to our bathroom. I opened the medicine cabinet with trembling hands, really looking at it for the first time since David's death. The top shelf held my usual items: moisturizer, vitamins, reading glasses. The bottom shelf had been David's domain. Behind his shaving cream and toothbrush, I found them. 4 prescription bottles, all from Oklahoma Heart Center, all filled within the past 6 months. I'd walked past these bottles every day for months, never thinking to look closely at the labels. Metoprolol, lisinopril, atorvastatin, nitroglycerin. I didn't recognize the names, but the warning labels were clear. Take with food, may cause dizziness, for chest pain, place under tongue. The last bottle made my knees weak. Nitroglycerin was for heart attacks, for emergency chest pain. David had been carrying his own portable emergency room. The dates on the prescriptions told a story of escalating medical intervention. The first bottle was dated 14 months ago, long before I'd noticed any changes in David's behavior. The most recent was filled just 2 weeks before his death, suggesting his condition had been getting worse right up until the end. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding the bottles, trying to remember if I'd ever seen David take these medications. He'd always been private about his morning routine, dismissing my offers to help organize his vitamins or remind him to take them. "I've got a system, sweetheart," he'd say. "Don't want to mess with what works." What worked, apparently, was hiding his deteriorating health from his wife. I called Marcus at dawn, my voice hoarse from crying. I found the medications. I told him, "Joan, I'm sorry. I should have told you where they were. You knew about these specific prescriptions." I picked them up for him sometimes, when he was too weak to drive to the pharmacy himself. Too weak, the words came out as a whisper. There were days when David was too weak to drive, and I never knew, mostly in the mornings. The medications would help and he'd feel better by afternoon. He timed everything around your schedule, Joan. He knew you went to water aerobics Tuesday and Thursday mornings, that you had book club on Wednesday afternoons. He scheduled his bad days around your activities. I thought about all the times I'd come home from errands to find David napping in his chair, how he'd always claimed he was just tired from working at the store, the times he'd suggested I go visit my sister in Tulsa for the weekend, saying he wanted to catch up on projects around the house. He was managing his symptoms around my schedule, I said, more to myself than to Marcus. He didn't want to change your life until he absolutely had to. He kept thinking he could get better, that the medications would be enough. I looked at the bottle of nitroglycerin, imagining David secretly taking these tiny pills whenever his chest hurt. How many times had I been in the same room, completely unaware that my husband was experiencing cardiac distress? The morning he died, I said, he seemed fine. We had breakfast together, talked about painting the guest room. How was that possible if he was so sick? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. David was good at hiding pain, Joan. He'd been practicing for months, but that morning, he called me before he left for work. He said his chest felt tight, that he'd already taken 2 nitroglycerin tablets. I told him to stay home, to call Dr. Rodriguez, but he went to work anyway. He said he couldn't disappoint Margaret. She was counting on him to help with inventory. He promised me he'd take it easy, that he'd call if the pain got worse. I closed my eyes, picturing David's last morning, his kiss on my forehead, his promise to pick up paint samples. He'd been having chest pains, and I'd been worried about wall colors. Did he call Dr. Rodriguez that morning? No. The doctor's office called me after they heard about David's death. They'd been trying to reach him for a follow-up appointment. His last visit was 2 weeks before he died, and the test results showed his condition had deteriorated significantly. What kind of deterioration? His ejection fraction, that's a measure of how well the heart pumps blood, it dropped to dangerous levels. Dr. Rodriguez wanted to admit him to the hospital immediately, but David refused. He said he needed time to get his affairs in order first. His affairs in order. David had been planning for his death while I'd been planning our golden anniversary celebration. 3 days after finding the medications, I received a call from our insurance agent, Betty Morrison. Her voice was carefully neutral, the tone people use when delivering potentially upsetting news. Joan, I need to discuss David's life insurance policy with you. There have been some recent changes that you should be aware of. What kind of changes? David increased his coverage substantially about 2 months ago. He also made some modifications to the beneficiary arrangements. I think it would be best if we met in person to go through the details. I drove to Betty's office with a growing sense of dread. She'd been our agent for 15 years, handling our car insurance, homeowner's policy, and David's modest life insurance. The changes she described sounded completely out of character for my careful, conservative husband. Betty spread the paperwork across her desk, her expression sympathetic but professional. David contacted me in early March, saying he wanted to review all your coverage. He seemed very focused on making sure you'd be financially secure if anything happened to him. The numbers on the policy documents were staggering. David had increased his life insurance from $150,000 to $500,000, a change that had nearly tripled their monthly premiums. Did David explain why he wanted such a large increase? I asked. He said he'd been thinking about inflation, about how much it would cost you to maintain your lifestyle without his income from the store. He was very specific about wanting to cover potential medical expenses, home maintenance, all the things he currently handled. But what disturbed me most was the beneficiary designation. While I remained the primary beneficiary, David had added Marcus as a secondary beneficiary for a portion of the payout, specifically $75,000 designated for business continuity and partnership obligations. Business partnership obligations, I read aloud. David and Marcus weren't business partners. Marcus has his own contracting company. Betty shifted uncomfortably. David mentioned something about informal business arrangements, shared investments. He said Marcus had helped him with some financial decisions and deserved to be compensated if anything happened. I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of David's reasoning. Why would he give Marcus $75,000 from his life insurance? And why hadn't he discussed any of this with me? There's something else, Betty continued. David asked very specific questions about the timing of payouts, about how quickly claims are processed. He seemed particularly concerned about immediate liquidity, making sure you'd have access to funds right away. Immediate liquidity for what? He mentioned potential medical bills, outstanding debts, business obligations that might need quick resolution. Joan, I have to ask, was David concerned about any financial problems you weren't aware of? The question hit me like a physical blow. What kind of financial problems? I don't know specifically, but his question suggested he was worried about immediate cash flow issues. He asked about accelerated death benefits, about whether life insurance proceeds could be garnished for business debts. My hands were shaking as I signed the paperwork acknowledging the policy changes. David had been planning for his death with the thoroughness of someone who knew it was imminent. But the financial complexity suggested problems that went far beyond his heart condition. Betty, can I ask you something? In your professional opinion, do these changes seem like normal estate planning, or do they suggest David was facing some kind of financial crisis? She chose her words carefully. In my experience, when someone makes sudden, dramatic changes to their life insurance, especially involving secondary beneficiaries outside the immediate family, it usually indicates complex financial circumstances. David seemed very stressed about making sure all the details were perfect. Driving home, I thought about David's behavior over the past few months, his increased attention to paperwork, his reluctance to discuss retirement finances, his suggestion that I not worry about boring business stuff. I'd attributed it to his methodical nature, but now it seemed more like systematic preparation for his absence. That evening, I called Marcus. Did you know David added you to his life insurance policy? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Marcus, yes, I knew. David insisted on it, despite my objections. Why would he do that, Joan? There are some financial complications regarding the store that David was trying to resolve. He wanted to make sure you wouldn't be burdened with business debts or partnership obligations. What partnership obligations? You and David weren't partners. Not officially, but we'd been working together on some projects. David had borrowed money to expand the store's inventory, and I'd co-signed some of those loans. He was worried that, if something happened to him, the creditors might come after your personal assets. The room spun around me. David borrowed money using our house as collateral. Joan, maybe we should discuss this in person. I found David's journal, purely by accident, while cleaning out his workshop. I was looking for his will, which Marcus said might be in David's desk, when I knocked over a stack of woodworking magazines. The leather-bound book fell out from between two issues of fine woodworking, its cover worn smooth from handling. David had never been a writer. In 40 years of marriage, I'd seen him struggle with Christmas cards and birthday notes, but this journal was filled with his careful handwriting. Entries dating back over a year. The first entry was dated 13 months ago, just after his initial visit to Dr. Rodriguez. Went to the doctor today about the chest pains. Joan thinks I was at the store doing inventory. Test results aren't good. Dr. R says I need more tests, probably surgery. How do I tell Joan that her husband's heart is giving out? How do I tell her we might lose everything trying to fix it? Sat on the floor of David's workshop, reading words that revealed a stranger. The husband I'd thought I knew had been fighting a private war against fear, guilt, and desperation. Joan looked so happy at breakfast this morning, talking about our trip to California to see the grandkids. She has no idea that I spent yesterday researching the cost of cardiac surgery. Even with insurance, we're looking at tens of thousands in out-of-pocket expenses. The house is paid off, but it might not stay that way if I get sicker. Entry after entry revealed David's internal struggle. He wrote about lying awake at night, listening to my peaceful breathing while calculating medical costs. He documented every symptom, every medication adjustment, every conversation with Dr. Rodriguez. Marcus thinks I should tell Joan everything. He doesn't understand that ignorance is the only gift I can give her right now. She deserves to sleep peacefully, to plan for our future, to believe that everything will be okay. If I tell her I'm dying, her world will become as dark as mine. The entries grew more desperate as his condition worsened. Had another episode at the store today. Margaret wanted to call an ambulance, but I convinced her it was just indigestion. Can't afford to scare the customers or employees. The business is already struggling. If word gets out that I'm seriously ill, we'll lose what little stability we have left. David wrote about the store's financial problems with devastating honesty. Competition from big box retailers had been eating into their profits for years. Online shopping had reduced foot traffic. The pandemic had nearly destroyed their customer base. Borrowed against the house again today. Marcus co-signed. Though he's worried about his own finances, the store needs new inventory for spring, and the suppliers won't extend our credit any further. Joan doesn't know we're 3 months behind on the business loan payments. I felt sick reading about David's financial desperation. While I'd been planning garden parties and anniversary celebrations, he'd been mortgaging our future to keep the store afloat. Saw Dr. R again today. My heart function has deteriorated significantly. He's recommending immediate surgery, possibly a transplant evaluation. The cost estimate made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so far beyond our means that it felt abstract. Joan would sell everything we owned to pay for my treatment. She'd sacrifice her security, her comfort, her future to buy me a few more years. I can't let her do that. The most heartbreaking entries were about me. Joan made my favorite dinner tonight, pot roast with all the vegetables I love. She was so proud that she'd remembered to buy the good rolls from the bakery. She has no idea this might be one of our last dinners together. She deserves better than a husband who's become a financial liability. Watched Joan in the garden today, planting flowers for spring. She was humming that song she always hums when she's happy. How do I tell the woman who still hums while gardening that her husband is dying? How do I destroy her optimism with my reality? The final entries, written in the weeks before David's death, revealed a man who'd made peace with his decision, told Marcus about the insurance changes today. He's not happy, but he understands why I'm doing this. If I die naturally, Joan gets enough money to maintain her lifestyle and pay off the business debts. If I pursue aggressive treatment and survive, we'll be financially ruined. If I pursue treatment and die anyway, Joan will be poor and alone. The math is simple, even if the emotions aren't. Joan kissed me goodbye this morning like she has every day for 40 years. She has no idea it might be the last time. Part of me wants to tell her everything, to have one honest conversation before I go, but honestly would only transfer my burden to her shoulders. She'll have the rest of her life to grieve. At least she won't have to spend it in poverty. The last entry was dated the morning David died. Chest pains started early today. Took 2 nitroglycerin tablets, but they're not helping much. Marcus wants me to go to the hospital, but I promised Margaret I'd help with inventory. Strange how normal activities become precious when you know they might be your last. Joan made perfect eggs this morning. I told her I loved her, and she smiled like she always does. Some gifts are too precious to unwrap early. Armed with David's journal, I confronted Marcus the next morning. He arrived at my house looking haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. When I showed him the journal, his face went pale. You read all of it, every word, including the parts about you co-signing business loans and encouraging David to hide his condition from me. Marcus sank into the kitchen chair, suddenly looking older than his 65 years. Joan, you have to understand, David was desperate. The store was failing, and his medical bills were mounting. I was trying to help, or were you protecting your own interests? I pulled out the life insurance documents, pointing to the $75,000 designated for Marcus. David wrote that you were worried about your own finances. What kind of financial trouble are you in, Marcus? His composure cracked. I made some bad investments, got involved with a group that promised quick returns on house flipping projects. I borrowed against my business, used my retirement savings. When the market turned, I lost everything. How much did you lose? Nearly $200,000. I was facing bankruptcy, foreclosure on my house. David knew I was in trouble, and he offered to help. The pieces began falling into place. So you convinced my dying husband to borrow money he couldn't afford to help you with your gambling debts. It wasn't gambling, it was investing. And I didn't convince David to do anything. He offered to help because that's the kind of man he was, but you let him mortgage our house to bail you out. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup. David said the store needed new inventory anyway. He convinced me that a short-term loan would solve both our problems. When business picked up in the spring, we'd pay everything back. Except David knew he was dying. He knew the store wouldn't survive without him. I thought his condition was manageable. The doctors said surgery could help, that he could have years of good life ahead of him. I encouraged him to pursue treatment. Because if David got better, you wouldn't have to worry about repaying the loans. Marcus flinched. That's not fair, Joan. I cared about David. I wanted him to get better for his own sake, not for my financial benefit. I opened David's journal to a specific entry. Listen to this. Marcus keeps pushing me to tell Joan about my condition, but I think he's more worried about the loan payments than my health. If I die, the life insurance will cover our debts. If I pursue expensive treatment and survive, we'll both be financially ruined. David was wrong about my motivations, was he? Because it seems like you had a lot to gain from David's death. No more loan payments, a $75,000 insurance payout, and potential control of a business that was worth more dead than alive. Marcus stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. I never wanted David to die. I loved him like a brother. But you didn't try very hard to save him. I begged him to tell you about his condition. I offered to tell you myself, but you didn't. Even when David was having chest pains the morning he died, you let him go to work instead of forcing him to get medical help. Marcus's face crumpled. I called him 3 times that morning. I told him to go to the hospital, but David was stuck. Know how he was. He said he had responsibilities, that people were counting on him. People like you, who needed him alive long enough to secure your financial future. That's not true. I pulled out another document I'd found in David's desk, a business partnership agreement, drafted by Marcus's attorney. Then explain this. You and David were planning to formalize your business relationship. According to this contract, you would have become a 50% partner in Merrick Hardware. Marcus went silent, staring at the document. David never mentioned any partnership to me. But according to this agreement, if David died or became incapacitated, you would have the option to buy his share of the business at a significantly reduced price. That was David's idea. He was worried about what would happen to the store if he died. He thought a partnership arrangement would protect your interests, or it would give you control of a profitable business for a fraction of its value. Joan, the store isn't profitable. It's been losing money for 2 years. Then why were you so eager to become David's partner? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because I thought I could turn it around. I had ideas about expanding into online sales, partnering with contractors for bulk supply orders. David was resistant to change, but if I had control. You saw David's illness as a business opportunity. No, I saw it as a chance to help both of us. David needed someone to take over the business responsibilities so he could focus on his health. I needed a stable income stream to recover from my investment losses, and if David died in the process, you'd inherit a business and collect enough life insurance money to solve your financial problems. Marcus looked at me with tears in his eyes. I never wanted David to die, Joan, but when he refused treatment, when he chose to let his condition progress naturally, I tried to make the best of an impossible situation. David was going to die whether I helped him or not. At least this way, his death would have some financial benefit for both our families. The cold calculation in Marcus's words chilled me to the bone. My husband's best friend had turned David's terminal diagnosis into a business plan. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to meet with me despite the ethical complexities of discussing David's case. A kind man in his 50s with graying temples and gentle eyes. He received me in his office at Oklahoma Heart Center with obvious reluctance. Mrs. Merrick, I want you to know how sorry I am for your loss. Your husband was a remarkable man who faced his diagnosis with tremendous courage. Courage or stubbornness? Dr. Rodriguez smiled sadly. Perhaps both. David was one of the most determined patients I've ever treated, but also one of the most frustrated. He opened David's medical file, pages thick with test results and consultation notes. Your husband's first visit was 14 months ago. He came in complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath, symptoms he'd been experiencing for several weeks. I never noticed any symptoms. David was very good at hiding his discomfort, but the initial tests revealed significant coronary artery disease. His main arteries were severely blocked, what we call triple vessel disease. It's a serious condition that typically requires immediate intervention. Dr. Rodriguez showed me David's echocardiogram results, explaining how the blocked arteries had damaged his heart muscle. Your husband's ejection fraction, the percentage of blood his heart could pump with each beat, had dropped to 30%. Normal is 55 to 70%. What did you recommend? Immediate cardiac catheterization, followed by either bypass surgery or angioplasty, depending on what we found. David's age and overall health made him an excellent candidate for surgery. We could have restored significant heart function and given him many more years, but he refused. Dr. Rodriguez nodded gravely. David listened to all the options, asked detailed questions about costs and recovery time, then politely declined. He said he needed time to think about it, to discuss it with his family, except he never discussed it with me. I assumed he had. At his follow-up appointment 2 weeks later, I asked about his family's thoughts on the treatment plan. David said you were supportive of whatever decision he made, but that you both had concerns about the financial impact. I felt a flash of anger at David's deception. Doctor, I never knew about any of this. If I had known David needed surgery, money would have been the last thing on my mind. Dr. Rodriguez looked genuinely shocked. David never told you about his diagnosis. I found out 3 months after he died, from his friend Marcus. The doctor was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications. Mrs. Merrick, I'm going to share something that I probably shouldn't, but I think you need to know. During David's final appointment, I was so concerned about his deteriorating condition that I offered to call you myself. What did David say? He became very agitated. He said that involving you would only make things worse, that you had enough stress in your life without worrying about his health problems. He made me promise not to contact you or any other family members. But surely you had ethical obligations. Patient confidentiality laws are very strict. Unless David was declared mentally incompetent or posed a danger to others, I couldn't override his wishes about medical privacy. I tried to convince him that family support would improve his treatment outcomes, but he was adamant. Dr. Rodriguez pulled out David's final consultation notes. Your husband's last visit was 2 weeks before he died. His condition had deteriorated significantly. His ejection fraction had dropped to 20%, and he was experiencing frequent chest pain despite maximum medical therapy. He must have insisted on surgery at that point. I told David that without immediate intervention, he had perhaps weeks to live. I offered to admit him to the hospital that day, to fast-track him for emergency surgery. He refused. He said he had business matters to resolve first, that he'd call to schedule surgery within the week, but he never called. No. When I heard about his death, I wasn't entirely surprised. David had been living on borrowed time for months. I stared at David's medical chart, trying to process the doctor's words. In your professional opinion, could David's life have been saved if he'd accepted treatment earlier? Almost certainly. If David had agreed to surgery when I first recommended it, 14 months ago, his prognosis would have been excellent. Even at his final visit, surgery could have given him several more years of good quality life. So he essentially chose to die rather than burden his family with medical expenses. Dr. Rodriguez chose his words carefully. David was very focused on the financial implications of his treatment. He asked detailed questions about insurance coverage, out-of-pocket costs, and payment plans. When I explained that even with insurance, his total expenses could reach $50,000 or more, he became visibly distressed. $50,000 wouldn't have bankrupted us. I tried to explain that to David. I told him about hospital, financial assistance programs, about payment plans that could make treatment affordable, but he seemed convinced that any medical expenses would create an unbearable hardship for his family. Did Marcus ever accompany David to appointments? Yes, several times. David said Marcus was his emergency contact since you weren't aware of his condition. Marcus seemed very supportive, very encouraging about pursuing treatment. Encouraging. Marcus urged David to be honest with you about his diagnosis. He said that family support was crucial for recovery, that you deserved to know what David was facing. I was impressed by his loyalty and concern. This contradicted everything I thought I knew about Marcus's role in David's deception. Marcus told me he supported David's decision to hide his condition. That's not what I observed. Marcus seemed frustrated by David's secrecy. During one appointment, he actually asked if I could speak with you directly, despite David's objections. I left Dr. Rodriguez's office more confused than ever. If Marcus had truly been encouraging David to tell me about his condition, why had he later claimed to support David's secrecy? Why had he allowed me to believe he was complicit in the deception when he'd actually been advocating for honesty? Unless Marcus's motivations had changed over time. As David's condition worsened and the financial implications became more complex, David's sister, Helen, called me from Phoenix the day after my visit with Dr. Rodriguez. At 73, Helen was 4 years older than David and the only surviving member of his immediate family. We'd always maintained a cordial relationship, but geography and busy lives had limited our contact to holiday cards and occasional phone calls. "Joan, I've been thinking about David's death, and there's something I need to tell you. Something about our family history that might help you understand why David was so afraid of heart problems." Helen's voice carried the weight of long-held secrets. I settled into my kitchen chair, sensing another revelation about my husband's hidden life. "David never told you how our father really died, did he?" "He said your father had a heart attack when David was in college." "That's true, but it's not the whole story. Daddy didn't just have a heart attack. He had been hiding heart disease for over 2 years before he died. He knew he was sick, knew he needed surgery, but he refused treatment because he was terrified of the medical bills." My heart sank. David's secrecy wasn't just about protecting MIT, was about repeating his father's pattern. "Daddy was 47 when he was diagnosed," Helen continued. "Same age as David was when he first started having chest pains, though David didn't know that. At the time, Daddy made Mama promise not to tell us kids about his condition. He said he didn't want us to worry or change our lives because of his problems." "What happened?" "Daddy struggled for 2 years, taking medications, trying to manage his symptoms. Quietly, he kept working, kept pretending everything was normal. Mama knew, of course, but she honored his wishes to keep it secret. The morning he died, he told Mama he was feeling better than he had in weeks. He went to work, had a massive heart attack at his desk, and was gone before the ambulance arrived." The parallel to David's story was chilling. "Did your mother regret keeping the secret for the rest of her life?" "She blamed herself for not insisting Daddy get proper treatment, for not telling us kids so we could help convince him. After Daddy died, Mama found out he'd been hiding other things too: financial problems, business debts, all sorts of complications that could have been resolved if she'd known about them. David knew all this. David was devastated by Daddy's death, but he was also angry. He felt betrayed that Daddy had hidden such an important thing from our family. He made me and Mama promise that if any of us ever got seriously sick, we'd be honest about it. But he broke that promise himself. That's what's so tragic. David swore he'd never put his family through what Daddy put us through. But when he faced the same situation, he made the exact same choice." Helen's voice broke slightly. "Joan, there's something else. David called me about 6 months ago, asking questions about Daddy's medical history. He wanted to know specific details about the heart disease, about the treatments Daddy had refused, about the financial impact of his death. He was researching his own condition." "I think so." "David asked if I still had any of Daddy's medical records, if I knew how much Daddy's funeral and final medical bills had cost. He seemed very focused on the financial aspects of terminal illness. I thought about David's journal entries, his obsession with medical costs and insurance coverage. He'd been using his father's death as a roadmap for his own." "Did David tell you he was sick?" "Not directly, but after that phone call, I suspected something was wrong. David had never shown much interest in family medical history before. When I tried to call him back a few weeks later to check on him, he was evasive, said everything was fine. I wish you'd called me. I thought about it, but David specifically asked me not to worry you with ancient family history. He said you had enough to think about without dwelling on old tragedies." Helen paused, and I could hear her crying softly. "Joan, I found something after David's funeral that I haven't known what to do with. David sent me a letter about a month before he died. I didn't open it until last week." "What kind of letter?" "A goodbye letter. David wrote that if I was reading it, then he was probably gone, and he wanted me to know how much our family meant to him. But he also wrote something else: instructions about what to tell you if you ever asked about Daddy's death." My hands were shaking. "What instructions?" "David wrote that if you ever found out about his heart condition, if you ever asked about family history, I should tell you the truth about Daddy. He said you deserved to understand that his secrecy wasn't about not trusting you, it was about being terrified of repeating Daddy's mistakes." "What mistakes?" "Daddy didn't just hide his illness, Joan. He also tried to hide the financial problems his condition created. When he died, Mama discovered that Daddy had borrowed money against their house to pay for medications, that he'd missed work and lost income but hadn't told her. Daddy's death left Mama not just widowed, but nearly bankrupt. And David was afraid the same thing would happen to me. David wrote that he'd rather die quietly than put you through the financial devastation that Mama experienced." He said that at least if he died suddenly, insurance would take care of you. But if he pursued expensive treatment and survived as an invalid, or if he pursued treatment and died anyway after racking up huge medical bills, you'd be left poor and alone. Did David know about your father's death certificate? Helen was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? I found a copy of your father's death certificate in David's papers. It lists the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction secondary to coronary artery disease. But there are handwritten notes in the margins. Notes about patient noncompliance with treatment recommendations. Oh my God. David had Daddy's medical records. It looks like David had been researching your father's case extensively. He had hospital records, insurance documents, even some of your mother's financial records from after your father's death. Joan, David, was using our family tragedy as a blueprint for his own death. The foreclosure notice was hidden in the back of David's desk drawer, folded small and tucked behind old tax returns. I found it while searching for more information about the business loans Marcus had mentioned. The document was dated just 3 weeks before David's death. Notice of default and election to sell under deed of trust. The heading read in bold letters. The property address was unmistakable, or family home of 40 years. According to the notice, David had missed 4 consecutive mortgage payments totaling $8,200. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings unless the full amount, plus penalties and legal fees, was paid within 30 days. I sat in David's office chair, staring at the document, trying to understand how this was possible. Our house had been paid off for over 15 years. We'd celebrated with champagne the day David made the final payment, joking about how we'd finally evicted the bank from our lives. But buried in the legal language were references to a home equity line of credit and business investment loan, secured by real property. David had remortgaged our house to fund the hardware store's expansion, and the business wasn't generating enough income to cover the payments. I called our bank immediately, asking to speak with David's loan officer. After 20 minutes of transfers and security questions, I reached Janet Walsh, a woman who spoke with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. Mrs. Merrick, I'm so sorry for your loss. David was a valued customer, and we were hoping to work out a payment plan before his passing. Janet, I need to understand exactly what loans David had with your bank. Are you listed as a co-borrower on any of the accounts? I don't know. I thought our house was paid off. Janet's silence told me everything I needed to know. Mrs. Merrick, I think you need to come in so we can review David's accounts in detail. There are some complex arrangements that would be better explained in person. The next morning, I sat across from Janet in her office, watching her spread David's loan documents across the conference table. The numbers were staggering. David first took out a home equity line of credit 18 months ago for $150,000. He used your house as collateral, and the funds were designated for business expansion and inventory investment. I never signed anything agreeing to that. In Oklahoma, spouses aren't required to co-sign home equity loans if the borrowing spouse owns the property individually. David inherited the house from his parents, so technically it was his separate property. My head spun. But we've been married for 40 years. Doesn't that make the house community property? Not necessarily, especially since David inherited it before your marriage and had maintained separate ownership. The legal details can be complex, but the practical result is that David could mortgage the house without your signature. Janet showed me the loan application, complete with David's financial projections for the hardware store. He'd painted an optimistic picture of expanding into online sales, partnering with contractors for bulk orders, and modernizing the inventory system. The business plan looked professional and well-researched. Did David's projections prove accurate? Unfortunately, no. The store's revenue actually declined over the past 18 months. Online competition and supply chain disruptions hit small hardware stores particularly hard. David's loan payments were current for the first year, but he started falling behind about 6 months ago. 6 months ago was when his heart condition was getting worse. David came in several times to discuss payment modifications. He was very worried about the impact on your financial security if anything happened to him. That's when he decided to increase his life insurance coverage. Janet pulled out another set of documents. 3 months ago, David took out an additional business loan for $75,000. This one required a cosigner because the store's financial position had deteriorated. Marcus cosigned. Yes, Marcus Chen provided personal guarantees and pledged his contracting business as additional collateral. The loan was supposed to provide working capital for inventory and give the store time to recover, but the store never recovered. David's attendance became sporadic over the final months. Employees mentioned that he seemed tired, that he was delegating more responsibilities to managers. Customer complaints increased, and several long-term commercial accounts were lost to competitors. I thought about David's journal entries, his descriptions of chest pain and fatigue that he'd hidden from everyone. While I thought he was working normal hours at the store, he'd actually been struggling to maintain basic business operations. Janet, what happens to these loans now that David is dead? The life insurance should cover most of the debt, but there will likely be a shortfall. The home equity line has grown to $165,000 with penalties and interest. The business loan is now $82,000. Combined with other business debts, we're looking at roughly $280,000 in total obligations, and David's life insurance pays $500,000. Yes, but some of that is designated for specific beneficiaries. After taxes and the designated payout to Marcus Chen, you'll receive approximately $380,000. That should cover the loans with some money left over, but not enough to maintain your current lifestyle indefinitely. I stared at the foreclosure notice, understanding finally why David had been so obsessed with life insurance payouts and immediate liquidity. He'd known that his death would trigger a complex financial settlement, and he'd tried to structure everything to protect me from homelessness and poverty. There's one more thing, Janet said gently. David gave me specific instructions about what to do if something happened to him. He made me promise to contact you immediately and help you understand all the financial arrangements. He was very concerned that you might be overwhelmed by the complexity. He planned for his death down to the last detail. David loved you very much, Mrs. Merrick. Everything he did was designed to ensure your financial security, even if it meant making some very difficult choices about his own health and the business. But as I drove home, I realized that David's careful planning had been based on a fundamental deception. He'd protected me from financial ruin by hiding the fact that we were already financially ruined. I found the suicide note draft while searching through David's computer files for business records. The document was saved in a folder labeled personal and dated just 6 weeks before his death. The file name was simply Letter to Joan. My dearest Joan, it began. If you're reading this, then I've taken the coward's way out, and I'm sorry. I've tried to be strong for you, tried to fight this illness and these financial problems, but I can't see any path forward that doesn't destroy everything we've built together. My hand shook so violently I could barely scroll down to read the rest. Dr. Rodriguez says I need surgery that will cost more money than we have. The store is failing, and I've already mortgaged our house to try to save it. If I pursue treatment and survive, we'll lose everything. If I pursue treatment and die anyway, you'll be left with crushing debt and no way to pay it. If I do nothing and let nature take its course, at least the life insurance will take care of you. The document was filled with crossed-out lines and revisions, as if David had written and rewritten his final thoughts multiple times. Some paragraphs were incomplete, abandoned mid-sentence when his resolve apparently faltered. I know this seems selfish, but living has become selfish too. Every day I don't tell you about my condition is another day I'm lying to the person I love most. Every day I don't seek treatment is another day I'm choosing death over debt. I can't live with these choices anymore, and I can't ask you to live with their consequences. Further down, David had written and deleted several versions of the same paragraph. I've been researching methods that would look natural, that wouldn't void the life insurance policy. A heart attack brought on by overexertion wouldn't be questioned. Missing a few doses of heart medication during a stressful period could cause cardiac arrest. I could make it look accidental, but then, in a different font suggesting it was added later, David had written, I can't do this to you, Joan. You'd blame yourself forever, wondering if you could have saved me if you'd known. I can't leave you with that burden on top of everything else. If I'm going to die, it has to be natural, even if natural takes longer than I want. The final version of the letter was much shorter. Joan, I'm sorry for all the secrets. I thought I was protecting you, but I realize now I was just protecting myself from your disappointment. You deserved better than a husband who was too proud to ask for help and too scared to face his problems honestly. Please forgive me for leaving you to clean up the mess I've made, but this final version was never sent. Instead, I found another document, created the same day, titled Letter to Marcus. Marcus, if something happens to me, please help Joan understand why I made the choices I did. Don't let her blame herself for not knowing about my condition. This wasn't about not trusting her, it was about loving her too much to burden her with an impossible situation. The insurance arrangements will take care of the financial problems, but Joan will need emotional support to get through this. You're the only person who knows the whole truth, so you're the only person who can help her heal. I called Marcus immediately, my voice shaking with rage. Did you know David was contemplating suicide? The long silence told me everything. Joan, did you know he was researching ways to kill himself that would look accidental? David was in a very dark place those final weeks. His physical pain was getting worse, and the financial pressure was overwhelming. I tried to talk him through it, talk him through planning his own death, talk him out of it. Joan, David called me several times in the middle of the night, saying he couldn't take it anymore. I spent hours on the phone with him, convincing him not to do anything drastic, but you never told anyone he was suicidal. You never got him professional help. David made me promise not to involve anyone else. He said if I told his doctors or his family, he'd disappear rather than be forced into psychiatric treatment. At least if I kept his confidence, I could try to help him find other solutions. What other solutions? I kept hoping he'd agree to tell you about his condition, that together you could find a way to manage both the health problems and the financial issues. I thought if David felt less alone, less like he was carrying everything by himself, the suicidal thoughts would fade. I was crying now, thinking about David lying awake in our bed, planning his death while I slept peacefully beside him. How close did he come to going through with it? Closer than I want to admit. There was one night, about a month before he died, when David called me at 2 a.m. He'd taken all his heart medications out of the bathroom, lined them up on the kitchen table. He was calculating how many pills it would take. What did you do? I drove over to your house, sat with David until dawn, talking him through his options. That's when we came up with the idea of letting his condition progress naturally while making sure you'd be financially protected. So you helped him choose a slower form of suicide. I helped him choose life for as long as possible while accepting that his time was limited. There's a difference. Joan, is there? Because it sounds like you helped my husband plan his death while convincing him not to seek treatment that might have saved his life. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. David was going to die whether he pursued treatment or not. His condition was too advanced, and he was too afraid of the financial consequences to pursue aggressive intervention. At least this way, he got to spend his final weeks at home with you, having normal conversations and normal routines. There was nothing normal about living with a man who was planning his death. But you didn't know that, Joan. David's gift to you was preserving your peace of mind during his final weeks. You got to love him without fear, without the constant worry that every conversation might be your last. That wasn't his choice to make for me. The forged power of attorney was discovered by accident when I tried to access David's business banking accounts. The bank manager, Susan Torres, called to inform me that someone had already been managing the accounts under a power of attorney agreement. I'm sorry, Mrs. Merrick, but our records show that Marcus Chen has been authorized to handle all business transactions for Merrick Hardware since 2 weeks after your husband's death. That's impossible. I never gave Marcus power of attorney. The document we have on file shows your signature authorizing Mr. Chen to act on behalf of the estate in all business matters. Would you like to review the paperwork? I drove to the bank immediately, my stomach churning with suspicion. Susan spread the documents across her desk, and I recognized the letterhead from David's attorney. But the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. This is a forgery, I said, pointing to the signature line. That's not how I sign my name. Susan examined the document more closely. Mrs. Merrick, this is very serious. If the power of attorney is fraudulent, then Mr. Chen has been accessing accounts illegally. What kind of transactions has he been making? Susan pulled up the account statements on her computer, substantial ones. Mr. Chen has withdrawn over $23,000 from the business operating account, supposedly for inventory purchases and operating expenses. He's also transferred funds between accounts and paid several large bills. Show me the details. The transaction history revealed a pattern of systematic theft. Marcus had been writing checks to himself for consulting fees and business management services. He'd paid his own company for inventory delivery and maintenance services that I knew had never been performed. Most shocking, he'd transferred $15,000 from the hardware store's account to pay off one of his personal credit cards. How long has this been going on? The first transactions occurred just 10 days after your husband's funeral. The activity has been consistent ever since. I thought about those early weeks after David's death, when Marcus had been so helpful with paperwork and business arrangements. While I'd been grateful for his assistance, he'd been systematically looting David's estate. Susan, I need copies of all these records, and I need to know what legal options I have. I'll contact our fraud department immediately. This appears to be a clear case of financial elder abuse and estate theft. I called Marcus from the bank parking lot, my voice cold with fury. Marcus, I'm at the bank looking at the transactions you've made using a forged power of attorney. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Joan, I can explain how you forged my signature to steal money from David's business. I wasn't stealing, I was managing expenses that David would have wanted handled. The store has ongoing obligations, rent, utilities, insurance, payments. Someone had to keep things running by paying yourself $23,000 in consulting fees. Joan, you don't understand how much work it's been. Keeping the business operational while dealing with creditors and suppliers. David would have wanted me compensated for that time. David would have wanted you to ask permission before accessing his accounts. I tried to discuss the business details with you, but you were grieving. You said you trusted me to handle everything. I trusted you to help me understand our options, not to help yourself to our money. Marcus's voice became defensive. Every transaction I made was necessary for business operations. The store was facing immediate closure if bills weren't paid. Then why didn't you pay those bills with legitimate funds instead of funneling money to your personal accounts? I used my own money first, Joan. The store owed me thousands of dollars for work I'd done over the past year. David and I had informal arrangements. Informal arrangements don't justify forging legal documents. I was planning to explain everything once the estate was settled. I kept detailed records of every expenditure. Marcus, you transferred $15,000 to pay off your credit card debt. How was that a business expense? The silence told me Marcus realized his lies were unraveling. That was a mistake. I was juggling multiple accounts, trying to cover expenses for both the store and my own business. Sometimes transfers got confused or deliberate. Joan, you have to understand my position. I've spent months managing David's affairs, dealing with creditors, keeping the business alive. I've invested my own time and money trying to preserve something of value for you, while helping yourself to whatever you could steal in the process. I never intended to steal anything. I was trying to salvage what I could from a bad situation, a situation you helped create by encouraging David to borrow money he couldn't afford. David's financial problems weren't my fault, no, but you made them worse. And now you're profiting from his death while pretending to help his widow. Marcus' voice cracked. Joan, I've been drowning financially for over a year. The investment losses, the failed business ventures, the mounting debt. I was desperate. When David died, I saw an opportunity to recover some of what I'd lost while helping preserve the store. So you decided to steal from a grieving widow. I decided to take what David owed me and what I'd earned managing his affairs. I kept hoping the store would recover, that I could pay back any temporary borrowing before you noticed. Temporary borrowing with a forged power of attorney. Joan, I know how this looks, but I never meant to hurt you. Everything I did was intended to benefit both of us. Everything you did was intended to benefit yourself. Marcus, David trusted you, and you betrayed that trust. I trusted you, and you betrayed that trust too. What are you going to do? I'm going to press charges for fraud, forgery, and theft. And I'm going to make sure everyone in this community knows exactly what kind of man you really are. Attorney Patricia Walsh had handled estate cases for 30 years, but she admitted that Marcus's fraud was among the most elaborate she'd encountered. Sitting in her downtown office, surrounded by law books and case files, Patricia explained the legal complexities of prosecuting someone who had been both a trusted friend and a business associate. Joan, what Marcus did constitutes multiple felonies: forgery, fraud, and theft from an estate, but proving intent will be challenging because of his legitimate involvement in David's business affairs. Patricia had spent 2 weeks investigating Marcus's financial activities, working with forensic accountants to trace every transaction. The full scope of his deception was staggering. Our investigation shows that Marcus has stolen approximately $47,000 from various accounts associated with David's estate. The forged power of attorney was just the beginning. She opened a thick folder containing bank records, canceled checks, and financial statements. Marcus created false invoices for services never performed, wrote checks to shell companies he controlled, and even charged the estate for personal expenses like his car payment and credit card bills. How long had this been going on? Some of the fraudulent activity predates David's death. Marcus had been manipulating the business accounts for at least 6 months, possibly longer. David's illness and distraction provided perfect cover for financial irregularities. Patricia showed me a timeline of Marcus's activities. The pattern suggests that Marcus initially intended to steal smaller amounts, maybe just enough to cover his immediate financial needs. But when David died and Marcus gained access to life insurance proceeds, the theft escalated dramatically. What about the business partnership agreement I found? Was that legitimate? The partnership documents were drafted by Marcus's attorney, but David never signed them. We found David's notes indicating he was considering the partnership but wanted to discuss it with you first. Marcus apparently decided to proceed as if the partnership was already in effect. So Marcus was planning to take control of the business whether David agreed or not. It appears that way. Marcus had prepared documents that would have given him majority control of Merrick Hardware in exchange for assuming the business debts. If David had lived and refused the partnership, Marcus would have been in serious financial trouble. Patricia leaned forward, her expression grave. Joan, I think Marcus saw David's illness as a business opportunity from the very beginning. He encouraged David to borrow money against your house, knowing that David was unlikely to live long enough to repay the loans. You think Marcus wanted David to die? I think Marcus wanted David's life insurance money and business assets. Whether David lived or died was probably secondary to Marcus's financial needs. The legal process moved quickly once Patricia filed criminal charges. Marcus was arrested at his office, handcuffed in front of his employees and clients. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, local contractor charged with defrauding widow. Marcus's attorney, Robert Kim, immediately contacted Patricia to discuss a plea agreement. Marcus couldn't afford a trial, both financially and reputationally. His contracting business was collapsing as clients canceled projects and suppliers demanded immediate payment. Marcus is willing to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for restitution and a reduced sentence. Robert told Patricia during a settlement conference. He's prepared to liquidate his assets to repay Mrs. Merrick. What assets? Patricia asked. Our investigation shows that Marcus is deeply in debt, with very little equity in his business or personal property. Marcus is willing to transfer ownership of his contracting business to Mrs. Merrick. The client contracts and equipment have some value. I attended the settlement meeting, wanting to see Marcus face the consequences of his actions. He looked terrible, thin, unshaven, aged by stress and guilt. When he saw me, he immediately began apologizing. Joan, I'm so sorry. I never intended for things to go this far. I was desperate, and I made terrible choices. How much of the money can you repay? Marcus's attorney answered for him. Approximately $30,000, plus the business assets. The rest was used to pay off Marcus's existing debts. So David's money went to pay Marcus's gambling debts and failed investments. I wasn't gambling, Marcus protested. I was trying to invest in legitimate business opportunities. When they failed, I got desperate. Patricia had prepared a detailed restitution plan. Marcus will liquidate his business, sell his house, and turn over all proceeds to Mrs. Merrick. He'll also serve 18 months in county jail and 5 years probation. What about the emotional damage? I asked. The betrayal of trust, the months of deception while I was grieving. Robert Kim looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Merrick, criminal court addresses the financial crimes. If you want to pursue damages for emotional distress, you'd need to file a separate civil lawsuit, which would cost more in attorney fees than I'd ever recover, Patricia explained later. Marcus simply doesn't have enough assets to make a civil suit worthwhile. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. Marcus would stand before a judge, admit his guilt, and accept responsibility for betraying his best friend's widow. But no amount of legal accountability could restore my faith in the man who had held me while I cried at David's funeral. Joan, Patricia said as we left the courthouse. "I want you to know that David would be proud of how you've handled this situation. You've shown tremendous strength in demanding justice. Justice won't bring David back or undo the lies he felt he had to tell. No, but it will ensure that Marcus faces consequences for his actions, and it will prevent him from victimizing other grieving families." That evening, I sat in David's workshop surrounded by the tools and projects that had brought him joy. Marcus had stolen money, but David had stolen something more precious: the chance to face his illness together. As partners who trusted each other completely, both betrayals hurt, but only one had been motivated by love. The newspaper article appeared on a Thursday morning, complete with Marcus's mugshot and a detailed account of his crimes. By noon, my phone was ringing constantly. Some callers offered support, but others seemed more interested in gossip than genuine concern. "Joan, I just can't believe it," said Nancy Porter, a woman I knew from church but had never been particularly close to. "Marcus seemed like such a trustworthy man. Are you sure there wasn't some misunderstanding?" The question stung. After months of investigating Marcus's deception, some people still found it easier to doubt my accusations than accept that their neighbor was a thief. Marcus pled guilty to multiple felonies. There's no misunderstanding, but he was always so helpful, so generous with his time. Remember when he fixed the church roof for free, and all the work he did for elderly people in the neighborhood? I'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. People who had benefited from Marcus's apparent generosity struggled to reconcile their positive experiences with the evidence of his crimes. At the grocery store, I overheard two women discussing my situation in the produce section. "I heard she's pressing charges against that nice Marcus Chen," one said. "Seems vindictive, if you ask me. The man was just trying to help her with business matters." "Well, I heard he stole over $50,000, the other replied. "That's not helping, that's stealing. But she's getting all that life insurance money anyway. Does she really need to destroy Marcus's life over a misunderstanding about business expenses?" I wanted to confront them, to explain that the life insurance money was needed to pay off debts David had hidden from me, that Marcus's business expenses were actually personal luxuries. But I'd learned that some people were determined to see me as the villain in this story. The hardware store employees were divided in their loyalty. Margaret Henderson, who had worked for David for 15 years, stood firmly behind me. "Joan, I saw things that didn't make sense after David died," she told me privately. "Marcus was coming in after hours, going through files, making decisions, without consulting you. When I asked him about it, he said you'd authorized everything, but something felt wrong." But other employees had developed close relationships with Marcus over the years. They'd seen him help David with heavy lifting, cover for him during medical appointments, and provide emotional support during difficult times. "Mrs. Merrick, I know what the papers say about Marcus," said Tom Bradley, the store's assistant manager. "But I also know he worked 18-hour days after David died, trying to keep this place running. Maybe he made some mistakes with the paperwork, but his heart was in the right place." The most painful reaction came from our pastor, Reverend Williams. He visited me at home, ostensibly to offer spiritual guidance, but his real purpose became clear when he began advocating for forgiveness and reconciliation. "Joan, I understand you're hurt and angry, but Marcus is also suffering. His business is ruined, his reputation destroyed. At some point, you have to consider whether pursuing criminal charges is consistent with Christian forgiveness." Reverend Williams, forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring criminal behavior. Marcus stole money from David's estate while pretending to help me through my grief, but Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek, to forgive those who trespass against us. Jesus also taught about justice and accountability. Marcus needs to face consequences for his actions. Perhaps, but destroying his life won't bring David back or heal your pain. I felt isolated by these conversations, as if seeking justice for Marcus's crimes somehow made me the aggressor. Some church members began treating me differently, offering polite but distant greetings instead of the warm fellowship I'd known for decades. But unexpected support came from surprising sources. Dr. Rodriguez called to express his sympathy and offer assistance with any medical questions that might arise during the legal proceedings. "Mrs. Merrick, I want you to know that I suspected David was under financial pressure, but I never imagined the extent of his problems. If I had known about Marcus's involvement, I would have insisted on involving you in David's treatment decisions. Helen, David's sister, flew in from Phoenix to attend Marcus's sentencing hearing. Her presence meant everything to me. "Joan, you're doing the right thing," she said as we sat in the courthouse waiting room. "David would be horrified to know that Marcus used his death as an opportunity for theft. You're protecting other families from becoming victims." The local newspaper received dozens of letters to the editor after the initial story ran. Most were supportive, but a few criticized my decision to prosecute Marcus. One letter particularly upset me. "Joan Merrick should be ashamed of herself for destroying a good man's life over money. Marcus Chen has helped more people in this community than anyone I know. This vindictive prosecution says more about Mrs. Merrick's character than Marcus's alleged crimes." But another letter provided perspective. "As someone who has worked in elder care for 20 years, I applaud Joan Merrick's courage in prosecuting financial abuse. Too often, families are reluctant to hold trusted friends accountable for theft, allowing predators to victimize multiple victims. Mrs. Merrick's willingness to seek justice may prevent other grieving families from suffering similar betrayals." The newspaper's editorial board eventually weighed in with a thoughtful piece about financial abuse of the elderly and the difficulty of prosecuting trusted friends and family members. They praised my difficult but necessary decision to put justice above personal relationships. Still, the community division was painful. David and I had lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, building friendships and contributing to local organizations. Marcus's crimes had forced people to choose sides, creating lasting rifts in relationships that had previously been sources of comfort and support. I began to understand why many victims of financial abuse choose not to prosecute. The legal system could hold Marcus accountable, but it couldn't restore the sense of community and trust that his betrayal had destroyed. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I finally found the courage to return to David's workshop. I'd been avoiding the space, unable to face the memories of happier times when David would spend hours building furniture and fixing household items. But the workshop held answers I needed about my husband's final weeks. The space looked exactly as David had left it. His tools were organized with characteristic precision, each item in its designated place. Half-finished projects sat on the workbench, a jewelry box he'd been making for our granddaughter's birthday, a birdhouse that would never be completed. But something caught my attention that I'd missed during my previous visits. David's tools on the main workbench weren't randomly arranged. They'd been positioned deliberately. The screwdrivers, wrenches, and measuring tools spelled out words when viewed from above. "Forgive me." I stood there for 20 minutes, staring at David's final message. He'd arranged his most precious possessions, the tools that represented his life's work and creative expression, into an apology. Even in death, David was trying to explain his choices. Under the workbench, I found a manila envelope labeled, "For Jonah Panafta." Inside were dozens of photographs David had printed from his phone, pictures I'd never seen. Most were of me going about my daily activities, unaware I was being photographed. Me gardening, reading on the porch, laughing with friends at church functions. Each photo had a handwritten note on the back. "Joan planting roses. May 15th. She has no idea I took heart medication 3 times today, but she's still humming. I want to remember her joy. Joan at book club. June 3rd. Dr. Rodriguez called with bad test results this morning, but Joan is discussing her favorite novel like nothing has changed. I love watching her when she doesn't know she's being watched. Joan making dinner. June 20th. Had chest pains all afternoon, but didn't tell her. She's wearing the apron our daughter gave her for Mother's Day. Some moments are too precious to contaminate with fear. The photographs revealed the depth of David's love and the extent of his sacrifice. While I'd been living normally, he'd been documenting my happiness, preserving memories of a wife who still believed in their secure future. One note particularly moved me. Joan sleeping peacefully. July 10th. I've been awake for 3 hours with chest pain, watching her breathe. She trusts me to take care of everything, to protect her from life's difficulties. Tomorrow I'll pretend to feel fine, and she'll believe me because that's what love looks like, trusting someone to carry burdens you don't even know exist. At the bottom of the envelope was a longer letter. David's explanation for his choices. "My dearest Joan, if you're reading this, then you've discovered my deception, and you're probably angry. You have every right to be furious with me for hiding my illness, for making unilateral decisions about our future. for robbing you of the chance to fight this battle together. But I want you to understand something. Every lie I told was an act of love. Every secret I kept was a gift I gave you. When I watched you sleep peacefully beside me, knowing I might not survive the year, I felt grateful that I could preserve your peace of mind for as long as possible. You would have insisted on the most expensive treatments, the most aggressive interventions. You would have mortgaged your future to buy me additional months or years. You would have sacrificed your financial security, your comfort, your own health to care for a sick husband. Couldn't let you do that, Joan. I've spent 40 years trying to make your life easier, trying to solve problems before they reached you. I wasn't going to stop protecting you just because I was dying. Yes, I should have trusted you with the truth. Yes, you deserve to make informed decisions about our final months together. But selfishly, I also wanted to live those months normally, without the weight of medical appointments and treatment discussions and constant reminders of mortality. I wanted to wake up next to you every morning and see hope in your eyes instead of fear. I wanted to have ordinary conversations about gardening and grandchildren, instead of extraordinary conversations about death and dying. I wanted to love you fully for as long as possible, without the distraction of fighting a battle I probably couldn't win. Marcus thinks I was wrong to hide my condition from you. He's probably right, but Marcus doesn't understand what it means to love someone more than your own life, to value their happiness more than your own honesty. The financial arrangements I've made will take care of you. The life insurance will pay off our debts and provide security for your remaining years. The store can be sold or closed without creating hardship. I've tried to solve every problem I can think of, to leave you with a clean slate and a fresh start. I know you'll grieve, and I'm sorry for causing that pain, but I also know you'll survive and eventually thrive, because you're the strongest, the person I've ever known. You just don't realize it yet because I've been handling all the difficult things for 40 years. It's time for you to discover your own strength, your own resilience, your own capacity for building a meaningful life. I couldn't bear to watch you struggle with my illness, but I'm confident you'll handle my absence with grace and wisdom. Please don't let anger about my deception overshadow the love that motivated it. Every decision I made was designed to protect and preserve the woman who made my life worth living. I love you, Joan. I always have, and I always will. Reading David's words, I finally understood the difference between his lies and Marcus's. David had deceived me to protect my future. Marcus had deceived me to protect his own. David's secrets were motivated by love. Marcus's were motivated by greed. Both men had robbed me of truth, but only one had done so out of devotion. Marcus's sentencing hearing took place on a cold October morning. 8 months after David's death, the courtroom was packed with community members, some supporting me, others there out of curiosity about the man who had fallen so far from grace. Judge Margaret Foster had reviewed all the evidence, the plea agreements, and the restitution arrangements. Marcus sat at the defendant's table wearing an ill-fitting suit, his face pale and drawn. The successful contractor who had once commanded respect throughout our community now looked like a broken man awaiting judgment. Mr. Chen, Judge Foster began, you have pled guilty to multiple felonies including fraud, forgery, and theft from an estate. These crimes were committed against Mrs. Joan Merrick during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life, while she was grieving her husband's death and trusting you to help manage his affairs. Marcus stood to face the judge, his hands shaking slightly. Before I impose sentence, I'm going to allow Mrs. Merrick to address the court with a victim impact statement. I had spent weeks preparing my statement, trying to find words that would convey the full scope of Marcus's betrayal without seeming vindictive. Standing at the podium, looking at the man who had comforted me at David's funeral while planning to steal from his estate, I felt a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and something approaching pity. Your Honor, Marcus Chen was my husband's best friend for 30 years. He was a man we trusted with our family secrets, our financial information, and our emotional well-being. When David died, Marcus became my primary source of support during the darkest period of my life. I paused, seeing Marcus wipe his eyes with a tissue. But while I was grieving and vulnerable, Marcus was calculating how much money he could steal before I noticed. He forged legal documents, created false invoices, and systematically looted my husband's estate. The financial damage is significant, but the emotional damage is immeasurable. I looked directly at Marcus. You didn't just steal money from me, Marcus. You stole my ability to trust, my faith and friendship, my confidence in my own judgment. You made me question everything I thought I knew about the people in my life. However, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm deeply disappointed and hurt, but I also recognize that you were drowning financially and made desperate choices. David would want me to acknowledge your years of genuine friendship before your circumstances led you to betrayal. I turned back to Judge Foster. I believe Marcus needs to face consequences for his actions, both to ensure justice and to prevent him from victimizing other vulnerable people. But I also hope that prison time will give him an opportunity to reflect on his choices and find a path toward redemption. Judge Foster nodded solemnly. Thank you, Mrs. Merrick. Mr. Chen, do you wish to address the court before I impose sentence? Marcus stood slowly, his voice barely audible. Your Honor, there's nothing I can say that will excuse what I did to Joan Merrick. She trusted me during the worst time of her life, and I betrayed that trust for money. He turned toward me. Joan, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, and I know words can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want you to know that your husband was the best friend I ever had, and you showed me more kindness during your grief than I deserved. Marcus's voice broke. I was desperate and scared, and I made terrible choices. But that's not an excuse. You lost your husband, and instead of helping you heal, I made your pain worse by stealing from you. I'll have to live with that shame for the rest of my life. Judge Foster reviewed the sentencing guidelines and restitution agreements. Mr. Chen, the crimes you committed represent a profound violation of trust during Mrs. Merrick's most vulnerable time. However, I also note your cooperation with the investigation, your full confession, and your genuine remorse. I hereby sentence you to 18 months in county jail, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution of $47,000 to Mrs. Merrick, and you are permanently barred from serving as a financial agent or estate executor for any person. Additionally, you will perform 500 hours of community service working with organizations that assist elderly victims of financial abuse. Perhaps your experience can help prevent others from making similar choices. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it came at the cost of destroying a man who had once been genuinely decent before desperation corrupted his judgment. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Walsh, my attorney, explained what would happen next. Marcus will begin serving his sentence immediately. The restitution payments will come from the sale of his house and business assets. You should receive most of the money within 60 days. What will happen to Marcus after he's released? That's up to him. His contracting license has been revoked, and his reputation is destroyed. He'll have to rebuild his life from scratch, probably in a different community. Driving home, I thought about David's journal entries, his fears about financial ruin, and the burden of medical expenses. The money Marcus stole would have been meaningful to David, but it wasn't worth destroying. A 30-year friendship. David's real gift to me wasn't financial security, it was the strength I'd discovered in fighting for justice. That evening, I called Helen in Phoenix to tell her about the sentencing. Joan, I'm proud of you for seeing this through. David would be proud too, I hope so. Part of me wonders if I should have just let it go, tried to forgive and move on. David chose to protect you from his problems, Helen said. You chose to protect other potential victims from Marcus's problems. Both choices required strength and love. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally begin moving forward. Marcus would face consequences for his betrayal. David's debts would be resolved, and I would have the chance to build a new life based on truth rather than secrets. The healing could finally begin. 1 year after David's death, I stood in the empty shell of what had been Merrick Hardware, watching contractors prepare the space for its new purpose. The store that had been David's legacy for 40 years would soon become the Merrick Center for grief support and financial advocacy, a place where widows and widowers could find help navigating the complex challenges of loss. The decision to sell the hardware business had been difficult but necessary. Without David's expertise and Marcus's stolen operating capital, the store couldn't compete with big box retailers and online vendors. But the building's central location and David's reputation in the community made it perfect for a different kind of service. Mrs. Merrick, the office spaces should be ready next week, said Jenny Martinez, the contractor overseeing the renovation. Are you sure you want to keep David's old office intact? I looked through the glass partition at David's desk, still arranged exactly as he'd left it. Yes, I want people to understand that this place was built by someone who cared about helping others. David's office will be a reminder of that legacy. The center was funded partly by David's life insurance money and partly by grants from organizations that supported elder abuse prevention. Dr. Rodriguez had agreed to serve on our advisory board, along with Patricia Walsh and several other professionals who understood the unique challenges facing grieving spouses. "Joan, this is exactly what our community needs," said Sarah Chen, the licensed counselor I'd hired to run the support groups. Ironically, she shared Marcus's last name but was no real coincidence that had initially made me uncomfortable but now seemed like a sign that healing was possible. Too many people suffer alone after losing a spouse, especially when financial complications are involved. Your experience with both David's secrecy and Marcus's fraud will help other families avoid similar tragedies. The center would offer 3 main services: grief counseling for people dealing with unexpected loss, financial advocacy for those struggling with complex estate issues, and legal education about protecting elderly people from financial abuse. We'd also provide referrals to attorneys, accountants, and other professionals who specialized in helping vulnerable populations. I'd obtained my certification as a grief counselor through an intensive 6-month program. At 67, returning to school had been challenging, but the experience taught me that personal tragedy could become professional purpose. The first support group meeting is scheduled for next Thursday, Sarah told me as we reviewed the week's schedule. We have 8 people signed up, 5 widows and 3 widowers, all dealing with issues related to financial deception or hidden debts. Any situations similar to mine? One woman discovered her husband had been hiding gambling debts for years. Another found out her spouse had been stealing from his employer to fund a secret drug addiction. A widower learned his wife had been sending their retirement savings to online romance scammers. Each story was unique, but the common thread was betrayal by someone they'd loved and trusted. David's deception had been motivated by love, but the result was the same. I'd been robbed of the chance to face our problems together. Helen called from Phoenix as I was locking up the center for the day. "Joan, I'm so proud of what you're building there. David would be amazed to see how you've turned your pain into purpose. Some days I still feel angry with him for hiding his illness. Other days I understand why he thought secrecy was the kindest option. That's grief, honey. It doesn't follow a linear path, and it doesn't resolve neatly. But you're using your experience to help other people, and that's the best possible tribute to David's memory." I drove home past the cemetery where David was buried. I'd started stopping there every few weeks, not to grieve but to update him on my progress. It felt strange talking to a headstone, but somehow necessary. "David, the center opens officially next week," I said, sitting on the small bench I'd had installed beside his grave. "I think you'd approve of what we're doing. We're helping people who are facing the same kind of secrets and financial problems that you were so afraid of." The evening news was running a story about elderly financial abuse, featuring an interview with me about the importance of prosecuting trusted friends and family members who steal from vulnerable people. "It's difficult to press charges against someone you care about," I told the reporter, "but financial predators often target grieving families specifically because they know we're emotionally vulnerable and unlikely to question their motives. By holding them accountable, we protect other potential victims." Marcus had been released from jail after serving 14 months of his 18-month sentence. He'd moved to a different state, started over with a new name and a new career. I'd heard he was working as a maintenance worker at a retirement community, a job that probably paid him less in a year than he'd stolen from me in 6 months. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but no regret either. Justice had been served, and other families had been protected from similar betrayals. My phone rang as I was preparing dinner. Michael, calling from Seattle to check on my progress with the grief center. "Mom, I saw the news story about your center. Dad would be so proud of what you're accomplishing. Your father was terrified of being a burden, but he gave me the greatest gift possible. He forced me to discover my own strength. I just wish he'd trusted me enough to face his problems together. Maybe his gift was bigger than he realized. If Dad had lived and you'd fought his illness together, you might never have discovered your calling to help other people." After dinner, I sat in David's workshop, now converted into my home office where I planned programs for the grief center. His tools were still arranged in their final message, "Forgive me," but I'd added my own message using smaller tools. "I do." The truth was complex. David had loved me enough to die quietly, rather than burden me with his medical battles. Marcus had loved money enough to steal from me while pretending to offer comfort. Both men had fundamentally changed my life, but only one had done so with honorable intentions. I'd learned to forgive David's protective deception, while refusing to excuse Marcus's predatory theft. Love and betrayal could coexist, but justice and accountability were necessary for healing. Tomorrow, I would open the doors of the Merrick Center and begin helping other people navigate the treacherous waters of grief, financial abuse, and family secrets. David's death had ended one chapter of my life, but it had also begun another one, where I used my pain to prevent other people's suffering. At 68, I was finally discovering who Joan Merrick could be when she wasn't protected from life's difficulties by a loving but secretive husband. The woman I was becoming would have made David proud, even if the journey to find her had required confronting truths he'd tried so hard to hide.